Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at Nasdaq. Joining me remotely is Phil Mackintosh, who's the chief economist at Nasdaq, to review how policymakers and investors are starting to model out the global economic impact of the coronavirus as the race is on to mitigate the spread of the virus and provide stability to the markets, investors, consumers, and the economy. And Phil, to open up the markets on this Monday, March 30th, stocks are sharply higher, although a little bit volatile in this session to kick it off. Is there any new intermediate, long-term, near-term good news that's out there to justify the move that we're seeing?
Yeah, no, I think it's a little surprising, to be honest. I feel like the weekend's news was fairly negative. We had Fauci coming out, Dr. Fauci is saying that the forecasts have America with potentially 200,000 deaths. We had President Trump backtracking on his Easter resumption of get back to work, and Americans are now talking about an April 30 extension, so another whole month of physical distancing or social distancing, or whatever we're meant to call it. And what that means for oil, a lot less demand. So the oil price was down significantly during the weekend as well, which is bad for energy and bad for some corporate bonds. I guess the flip side, because clearly there has to be some good news that the market's reacting to, is that there has been some discussion about vaccines. There's some progress being made, although I don't think we want to think about it in the next month or two. Maybe in fall, we might have some vaccines that are getting broader testing. And then there's also the testing itself. So there's some new testing facilities and a ramp up of actual available medical equipment as well. So maybe it's those positives that have sort of overwhelmed the media over the weekend to talk about the ongoing new cases.
All right, let's go back to the oil conversation for a second, pulling up our first chart here so we can actually see what demand looks like in different parts of Asia. And the bottom line is that there's simply a reduction in demand. Oil is going to continue falling farther. And do you think there's a possibility we're just going to run out of places to store oil? And what does that look like in terms of WTI? Could that go, any lower than it is right now?
Yeah, and that's what people are talking about. I mean, I'm obviously not an oil expert, but reading what people who are talking about is potentially you could have people being paid to take oil. So a negative oil price, at least if there's too much supply and that needs to be stored somewhere. The discussions at the moment are saying that there's weeks to maybe a month or two of capacity to keep storing oil, but obviously that's not going to be something that people are paying a whole lot for. So there's definitely downside risk to oil unless we can reduce the supply of oil to offset the demand drops. And these charts just talk to the demand drops. I mean, there's plenty of other charts that would talk about how much less energy people are using. There's the pollution charts that show that there's a lot less energy usage and polluting in other countries that are on lockdown. But these charts are just astounding. The number of arrivals coming into Asian airports is dropped to almost zero. And the American airlines are probably not far behind.
Yeah, and if we take a look at our second chart here, and this goes back to social distancing, which has now been put in place on the federal level, at least through April 30th, we can see that the curve is flattening in some areas, but except for the US and the UK, where we were quite frankly a little bit slow to the response here.
Yeah, and I guess what's really important about this chart is looking at the bottom axis, because that's days from when you get 100 cases. And a lot of countries, once they're a month in, do seem to get this under control. You can see that for Korea, you can see that for China, which are the two countries we often talk about. Even Italy has started to slow the slope of its curve. And that's important, but then you look at what it's taken China to reopen its economy, and it's taken another month for them to be really confident that they've clamped down on most of the new cases, that the risk of getting outside and doing things is low. And so it kind of puts in perspective the timelines that we're looking at. If we can get under control the growth of new cases, it's probably still another month until we're really confident that those new cases get recovered and there's no new cases that form in between times.
Yeah, and if we take a look at our third chart of the day, because we always like to try and end on a positive note here, yes, there are cases rising in the U.S., but it appears to be at a much slower rate than if we were to have not practiced social distancing.
Yeah, so this is actually global data, so it's probably an even better story. But the US chart looks exactly the same. It's just that the US has sort of got to 18,000, 19,000 new cases a day, and it hasn't broken through the 20,000 cases a day level. The global cases have seemed the last 4 days to have plateaued at 60,000 new cases. So The good news is all of the social distancing that most countries have now put in place might actually be starting to work. And this is exactly what we saw in the China data. It's exactly what we saw in the Korea data. There was an exponential increase in cases until everybody got serious about not transmitting it across each other. And once you started to get it under control, you can reduce the new cases per day. And China and Korea are probably the best proof points that you can, if you keep the people that are contaminated or contagious away from everybody else, you can actually stop the virus in its tracks.
And that's certainly encouraging. And one other interesting tidbit you had pointed out in your morning note, that activists are actually taking a back seat for a bit as companies are coping with the spread of the virus and really focusing on day-to-day operations.
Yeah, so activists often have proxies that they put into the annual meetings for all of the corporates to get votes on. And obviously, I mean, it's tough enough for a corporate as it is. They've got lots more things to worry about. And I think this is symbolic of a lot of the changes in the corporate America, where people are just getting behind the social aspects of the virus and trying to make it easier. Obviously, the big rescue plans last week were there and fully supported by both sides of the House and the Senate. So I think everybody realizes it's just important to get society through this and then think about the economy and corporate profits later.
All right, Phil, great stuff as always. Thank you so much for making the time to join us.
You're welcome.
All right, and thank you for joining me on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.